He stood in the quiet hallway, the only sounds the soft hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and the frantic, muffled thud of his own heart. The full-length mirror at the end of the hall didn't just reflect him, it held him captive. The person looking back was achingly familiar and yet breathtakingly new, a version of himself he had only met in the fugitive whispers of his deepest daydreams. The cream blouse, a soft and yielding fabric he'd never dared to touch in a store, softened the sharp lines of his shoulders. A pale green silk scarf, the first of his aunt's quiet offerings, was knotted loosely at his throat, a touch of color against his pale skin. Over it all, her gray cashmere cardigan fell open, framing the image with a tenderness that felt like an embrace. It wasn't a costume. It wasn't a disguise. In the stark, revealing light of the hallway, it felt like a homecoming. His breath hitched. The constant, low-grade static of anxiety that had hummed under his skin for years seemed to momentarily quiet, replaced by a terrifying, exhilarating clarity. His aunt's voice, gentle and steady as a ship's compass, came from the living room. "Alex? I'm about to start the stream. The Emperor's throne is waiting." He had agreed to be her off-camera audience, a silent participant in her weekly makeup tutorial. It was meant to be a joke between them, a way for him to be present without being seen. But now, looking at the person in the mirror, the person he was both terrified and thrilled to finally see, the idea of hiding in the shadows felt like a betrayal. It felt like stuffing this fragile, emerging self back into the dark box where it had lived for so long. He took a slow, deliberate breath, the fabric of the blouse cool and smooth against his skin, a silent affirmation. This month away from the city, from the relentless demands of his life, wasn't just about rest. He was beginning to understand that it was about waking up. And he was so tired of being asleep. He was 24, an age that felt both too young to be so bone-tired and old enough to recognize when kindness was a velvet glove hiding a strategic plan. "A month will do you a world of good," Aunt Eleanor said over the phone. Her voice was a warm, honeyed thing he remembered from childhood summers spent chasing fireflies in her sprawling garden. The same softness, but now underpinned by a new, unwavering steadiness. Fresh air. No deadlines, no screens. "You've been grinding yourself down to dust, Alex." He pinched the bridge of his nose, the pressure doing nothing to soothe the headache that had taken up permanent residence behind his eyes. Across his small apartment, the glow of 2 monitors spat a relentless stream of unread emails into the dim light. The project was over, technically. He had met the impossible deadline, but the victory felt Pyrrhic, leaving him sleepless, coffee-stained, and hollowed out. "I can't just disappear for a month, Aunt El. The world doesn't stop." "But you can," she said, her tone gentle but firm, leaving no room for argument. "Your mother agrees. I already spoke to her." That last sentence landed not like a pebble but a stone in the still, murky pond of his anxiety. Ripples. A familiar tightness bloomed in his chest, a suffocating vine he couldn't name. It was the "we've been discussing you" of it all, the sense of being a problem to be managed. "You talked to Mom." It wasn't a question. A pause, small but dense with unspoken meaning. "She worries," Eleanor said softly. "We both do." He exhaled a laugh that was more air than sound, a tired surrender. The fight had gone out of him days ago, maybe weeks. "Okay," he said, the word tasting of defeat and, to his surprise, a sliver of profound relief. "Okay, fine. Your country house and your nosy birds and your famously terrible instant coffee. A month." He meant it to sound like a joke, a sarcastic concession, but the current of gratitude that ran through him wasn't funny at all. An off-ramp. Space. Maybe she was right. The train ride out of the city was a jarring zipper, cutting through the dense fabric of concrete and noise to open up wide, green fields and slow, meandering rivers. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window and watched the city melt into a blur of trees. He told himself this was rest. This was a mandated escape. He did not think about the cardboard box buried on the highest shelf of his old closet at his parents' house, hidden under a pile of forgotten hockey jerseys. The box, he had long convinced himself, was safe precisely because nobody ever looked that high. He didn't think about it, which meant, of course, that he thought about it every 10 minutes. The weight of it, the dusty silence of it, the truth of what was folded inside. It was a constant, low-level hum beneath the rhythm of the train's wheels, a secret that felt more like a part of his own anatomy than a collection of objects. The thought was still circling when the train hissed into the station of his aunt's small, quiet town. Eleanor was there on the platform, a bright magenta scarf a beacon against the muted tones of the afternoon. She was 48 and somehow, impossibly, looked exactly the same as every age he'd ever known her to be. He folded himself into her hug, a lanky, exhausted frame against her solid warmth, and felt a knot he hadn't realized he was holding in his spine begin to unclench. "You look tired," she murmured into his shoulder, her voice muffled by his jacket. "But your eyes look relieved." "Don't read me like a fortune cookie," he muttered into the soft wool of her scarf, though he didn't pull away. The air here smelled different, not of exhaust and hot pavement, but of damp earth, cut grass, and something vaguely floral he couldn't place. It was the scent of a world that moved at a slower, more deliberate pace. A world where, just maybe, he could finally catch his breath. Eleanor's house sat a short, breezy bike ride from the station, nestled amongst trees that seemed to lean inconspiratorially. It was half warm wood, half expansive glass, the kind of modern but gentle architecture that made the weather feel like an invited guest rather than an adversary to be kept out. She'd renovated since his last visit years ago, opening up the kitchen into a single, light-drenched space and adding an army of houseplants that draped from shelves and climbed up walls like lazy, green cats. Instead of being hung with rigid precision, framed photographs were leaned casually along a long shelf, a mix of faded childhood pictures and vibrant landscapes. It was a home that felt curated but not sterile, a place that knew how to breathe. As he rolled his suitcase over the threshold, his eyes were drawn to the end of the main hallway. A full-length, antique mirror with a dark, carved wood frame stood there, its glass catching the light from a new skylight and making the corridor look longer, almost infinite. "You finally got your mirror," he said, the observation surprising him as it left his lips. He remembered her talking about it for years. "Didn't you used to have a saying? A house without a mirror doesn't know itself." "I still say it," she replied, brushing a light kiss to his cheek as she took his jacket. She smelled of cinnamon and fresh air. "And I think people are houses, too, Alex." He offered a small smile that he hoped looked casual, as if he hadn't really heard the weight in her words. But he had. The sentence echoed in the sudden quiet of the house. His room was a study in soft light and clean lines. The bed was dressed in crisp, white sheets that smelled faintly of lavender. A large window framed a perfect, moving slice of an apple orchard, the leaves winking and shimmering in the late afternoon breeze. On the dresser, a small ceramic dish sat waiting for his keys and wallet. Beside it, a glass of water was already sweating, a tiny sprig of lavender resting against its side in a miniature bud vase. The sheer intentionality of it, the quiet anticipation of his needs, made something deep inside him ache. It wasn't sadness, but a related, more hollow feeling. It was the ache of realizing how little space he had made for himself in his own life, how starved he was for this kind of simple, preemptive care. "You'll rest," Eleanor said from the doorway, her voice soft, not wanting to break the spell of the room. "There's soup on the stove for whenever you're hungry. And if you must log into anything," she added, her tone shifting to one of playful warning, "I will confiscate your laptop with righteous auntly force." He managed a genuine laugh, the sound feeling rusty in his throat. "I wouldn't test you." For the first 2 days, rest was not a dramatic, soul-altering event. It was an accumulation of small, quiet negatives. He slept without the shriek of an alarm, waking only when the sun told him to. He walked the dirt road until it kissed the edge of the riverbank and sat on a large, flat rock, watching dragonflies stutter and hover over the water's surface. He ran a hand through the shaggy, warm fur of a neighbor's golden retriever that roamed without a leash and greeted him with a happy, thumping tail. He answered his mother's text message, settled in, with a photo of the orchard and 3-leaf emojis, because forming words to describe the tightness in his throat felt like an impossible task. At night, He and Eleanor cooked side by side in her open kitchen. The food was simple, honest. Tomatoes, still warm from the sun, torn over pasta with fresh basil. Garlic toasted in olive oil until the smell became the very definition of comfort. Thick slices of crusty bread, warmed in the oven. She asked about work, but without digging, her questions gentle probes about the process, not the soul-crushing results. He found himself telling her the story of the impossible timeline, of the client who changed their entire vision in the final week, of how he'd become a ghost in his own apartment, a pale creature living only in the glow of his screens. "You're not a machine," she said simply, ladling rich, dark tomato soup into a bowl for him. "Even if machines sometimes wish they could be you." He stirred his soup, watching the steam curl into the air. Uninvited, a different story rose in him, hot and urgent. The story of how sometimes he wanted to be someone else entirely. Someone whose reflection in the shop windows he hurried past didn't feel like a stranger. Someone whose inner world matched the softness that lived under his ribs like a terrified, hidden bird. He swallowed the confession back down like soup that was too hot. Not here. Not now. He didn't know why he thought that. And a second, more dangerous thought followed immediately after. Maybe here is exactly, finally, the only where. On the third morning, Alex woke to the sound of gentle scraping against the blinds and a voice drifting from downstairs. It was Eleanor's, but with a different cadence, the smooth, practiced rhythm of a presentation. He heard her laugh, then talk about undertones and blending. Curiosity pulled him from the soft cocoon of the bed. He followed the sound to the kitchen, where her tablet was propped against a fruit bowl, the screen showing a paused video frame. On it, his aunt was in the middle of a live stream, swatches of color painted on the back of her hand like an artist's palette. "You do makeup tutorials now?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep as he poured a coffee. The dreaded instant coffee he joked about was nowhere in sight. This was the good stuff, from a French press, dark and fragrant. She shrugged, rinsing a handful of blueberries in a colander, not missing a beat. "It started during the lockdown. It's less about glamour and more about community," she explained. "We talk about light and shadow, about confidence. Sometimes people just need an excuse to be kind to themselves for 10 minutes. He sipped the coffee, its warmth spreading through his chest, and glanced at her hands. She had always had a steady, deliberate touch. He remembered those hands sewing a patch onto his ripped jeans with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. He remembered them patiently fixing a wobbly shelf in his first apartment, and once, years ago, braiding his hair when they were both silly from too much sun and sugary lemonade at a family picnic. The memory surfaced with a sudden, inexplicable heat, a phantom embarrassment that made him set his mug down a little too fast, the ceramic clinking against the stone countertop. "You okay?" Eleanor asked, her gaze sharp but gentle. She'd caught the flinch. "Fine," he said, and for a moment he meant it, and for another, he didn't. That afternoon, while he surrendered to a deep, drooling, mouth-open sleep he would never admit to, Eleanor must have done his laundry. When he woke, the world outside was painted in the long, golden strokes of late afternoon. On the chair in his room sat a neatly folded pile of his t-shirts, arranged like a polite, monochrome parade. On top of the pile, however, was a single item he did not own. A silk scarf, the color of new spring leaves, as soft as a breath. It lay there not as an afterthought, but as a statement, as if it had been there all along. He picked it up before he could talk himself out of it. The fabric slid over his fingers like cool water. He told himself she'd left it there by accident, a stray piece from the wash that had gotten mixed in with his things. He told himself he would walk it to her room in a moment and place it on her dresser, where scarves presumably lived. He stood there holding it for a long time, long enough for the light filtering through the window to shift on the floorboards, turning from gold to a soft, dusky rose. In the mirror at the end of the hallway, he caught a lengthwise slice of himself. Rumpled hair, a sleep line creasing his cheek, and this impossible, beautiful scarf draped over his hand like a question mark. "Dinner in an hour," Eleanor called from somewhere downstairs, her voice pulling him from his trance. "If you want to help, I could use a taste tester. The good kind, not the I'm just pretending to be nice kind. Coming, he called back, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. He was still looking at the mirror. Without meaning to, without a conscious thought directing the movement, he brought the scarf up to his collarbone, just to see how the pale green sat against the gray of his t-shirt, against his skin. It's a thought experiment, he told himself fiercely. It's nothing. In the kitchen, he found a small, silver compact mirror open on the counter, its lid reflecting a perfect coin of afternoon sun onto the ceiling. It seemed deliberately placed, near the cutting board where he would work, but far from the sink where it might get wet. He snapped it closed without thinking, the click sounding loud in the quiet room. Then, feeling suddenly foolish, he opened it again and saw his own eye, magnified and too close, dark and profoundly unsure. Eleanor was watching him watch himself. She leaned a hip against the opposite counter, a wooden spoon held in her hand like a conductor's baton. Her face was a canvas of kindness, but threaded with something else he couldn't quite name. Patience, maybe. Or resolve. You cut your hair shorter, she said, her tone casual, as if that explained everything. It suits you. Shows off your jaw. He touched his jaw instinctively, as if he hadn't noticed he had one before this moment. It was hot in the city. It was, she agreed, turning to stir the onions that were beginning to sizzle in a pan. The kitchen filled with their sharp, surrendering scent. Sometimes we change things because it's hot. And sometimes, she added, not looking at him, it's because we're ready for something new. Alex carefully set the green scarf on the back of a kitchen chair, the silk pooling like a sigh of relief. The gesture was a small retreat, a re-establishment of a boundary that had felt perilously close to dissolving. You left this with my laundry. Eleanor glanced at the scarf, then back at him, her eyes wide with a practiced innocence. Did I? How clumsy of me. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, a slow, weary exhalation that seemed to carry weeks of tension with it. You're doing a lot of gestures, he said, searching for the right word. What kind of gestures? She asked, her voice even as she tasted the sauce from the wooden spoon, her expression one of pure culinary focus. The kind that make a person wonder if there's something you're not saying. She set the spoon down deliberately on a ceramic rest. I'm saying exactly what I mean, Alex, she replied, and then her expression softened, the strategic mask melting away into a quick, genuine smile. That you're safe here. That's all. The words landed so gently he almost missed their immense weight. Safe. He had felt secure, he had felt comfortable, but safe was a different thing entirely. It implied the existence of a danger, a threat that she was acknowledging without needing him to name it. It was a profound and terrifying gift. He could only nod, the simple motion feeling inadequate. He didn't know how to say thank you for something this big without saying far too much. After dinner, the sky bled into a bruised, moody blue, the kind that makes the warm glow of porch lights feel like stars you can control. He stepped outside onto the porch, breathing in the cool, damp air that smelled of night-blooming flowers. The world felt vast and quiet around him. From the doorway, Eleanor's voice came, pulling him back. I do a little stream on Thursdays. 10 minutes, nothing dramatic. If you find yourself bored, you can be my official audience. He turned. Your makeup thing? Light and shadow and confidence, she corrected, a hint of amusement in her voice. You can sit just off camera and eat grapes like a Roman emperor. I'll do my best to pretend I'm not intimidated by your imperial presence. He hesitated. The offer hung in the air between them, shimmering with unspoken significance. He imagined the mirror at the end of the hall, the compact on the counter, the scarf still resting on the chair like a silent, green breath. He imagined saying yes. He imagined watching her steady, careful hands and letting that steadiness settle the tremor in his own. It was a step into a space that was hers, a space of unapologetic softness and self-creation. The safe answer was no. The easy answer was to retreat to his room. Sure, he heard himself say, the word feeling both foreign and inevitable. Audience, grapes, emperor. I can do that. "Perfect," she said, and her smile held a quiet satisfaction, but not triumph. This wasn't a victory she had won over him. This was an opening he had just walked through himself. Later, when the house was steeped in the deep quiet of late evening, the only sound the faint tick of a cooling oven, he found himself standing in the hallway again. He didn't switch on the light. The mirror caught him in its full height, a silhouette against the lesser dark. He picked up the scarf from the chair where he'd left it. He held it up to his throat where a tie might go, then let it drape lower, where a necklace might lay. He watched his own face in the gloom, searching for the familiar flinch of self-rejection, the recoil he knew so well. Instead, he saw only a softening, a blurring of the sharp, defensive lines he presented to the world. He put the scarf down and turned off the last light, but the afterimage followed him into the dark of his room. It was the outline of himself, but gentled. His edges, for the first time he could remember, didn't feel quite so sharp. In bed, Alex found his phone and texted his mother without consciously deciding to. "It's peaceful here." 3 dots appeared and disappeared for a moment before she replied. "Good. Breathe." And then, after a beat that felt longer than was accidental, a second text, "I'm proud of you." He stared at those words until they blurred, the white light of the screen swimming in his vision. He didn't know what, exactly, she was proud of. He didn't ask. He let the question fold itself into the quiet dark of the room, into the deep, restorative sleep he was finally getting, undisturbed by the familiar hum of urban anxiety. In the morning, he woke to a new note beside the coffee maker. "Stream at 7. Need an audience." A small, hand-drawn smiley face was tucked into the corner, a little smug. Next to the note, the silver compact mirror, closed this time, and the green scarf, folded neatly now, not draped, as if some decision had been made in the night by the objects themselves. He ran a thumb over the smooth, cold metal of the compact and felt his heartbeat answer in his fingertips. He told himself this was rest. He told himself this was nothing more. He told himself he was safe. Out in the orchard, the leaves whispered in the breeze, saying yes to the wind, and no one argued. He said yes to breakfast. Yes to the sun on his face. Yes, just for now, to being watched over by someone who could see things he was not yet ready to say. That night at 7, the kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon from the apple crisp Eleanor had baked earlier. The faint buzz of her voice drifted from the living room, and Alex followed it like a string leading him to a new reality. She'd transformed one corner of the room into something halfway between a beauty studio and a cozy reading nook. A ring light on a tripod cast a warm, professional glow. The tablet was balanced on a stack of cookbooks. A vase of yellow wildflowers was angled perfectly inside the camera's frame. It looked casual, but the arrangement was intentional, deliberate. "You're just in time," she said, her voice shifting into a professional brightness as she pulled a chair into the shadows, out of the reach of the ring light. "Here, this is the Emperor's throne." He smirked, but sat, setting the bowl of grapes she'd promised him on the side table. "Do I need to look approving?" "Only if you feel approving," she said, adjusting the camera. Her hair was pulled back, and a soft cardigan fell open over a patterned blouse. She'd pinned a brooch in the shape of a paint palette near her shoulder. When the stream went live, her voice shifted, still warm, but with a new, authoritative precision. She greeted names in the chat as if they were old friends. She swiped swatches of foundation on the back of her hand, explaining undertones. She laughed at someone's comment, then leaned forward into the lens, her gaze direct and captivating. "Light and shadow aren't enemies," she said to the camera. "They define each other. You just have to decide which you want to show more of today." He popped a grape into his mouth and watched the way she worked. She wasn't selling makeup. She was selling the idea that people deserve to see themselves with kindness. Halfway through, she glanced sideways at him, her eyes catching the light. "You there, Alex. Tell me which blush looks better in this light." He froze, his hand halfway to the grape bowl. The camera wasn't on him, but every pair of eyes on the other side of the screen was a possibility, an intrusion, 1,000 judgments waiting to be made. The left hand, he managed, his voice a little shaky. Interesting choice, she said, a small, knowing smile ghosting her mouth as she showed the options to the camera. Left is softer, more forgiving. It doesn't scream, "Look at me," but invites a second glance. The chat lit up with agreement and gentle teasing. He caught one message before she scrolled past, "Bring the Emperor on camera." He rolled his eyes, but a flush of heat rose to his cheeks anyway. When the stream was over, she switched off the light, and the room fell into its ordinary shadows. "Thanks," she said simply. "It's easier with someone in the room. Even a silent audience changes the air." He shrugged. "I was just here for the grapes." She didn't press. She never pressed. But as he stood to leave, she picked something up from the arm of the sofa, the compact mirror, the same one from the kitchen, and slipped it into his hand. "You left this on the counter," he said. "I know," she replied. "But I think it's yours for now." Upstairs, in the soft light of his room, Alex set the compact mirror on his dresser. It sat there, a small, silver circle against the dark wood, looking less like a stray object and more like a piece of punctuation at the end of a sentence he hadn't yet finished writing. It was a period. A statement. He didn't touch it again, but he was acutely aware of its presence as he prepared for bed, a silent, silver eye in the quiet room. That night, he dreamed of the box. It wasn't a nightmare, not in the traditional sense of being chased or falling. It was more unsettling. In the dream, he was standing in the doorway of his childhood bedroom, the one at his parents' house. The air was thick with the dusty smell of memory. He looked toward the closet where he knew the box was hidden, on the highest shelf, buried and safe. But it wasn't there. It was on the floor, in the middle of the room, lying open. Sunlight, thick and golden, poured from an unseen window, illuminating the contents. The folded clothes, the scarves, the carefully stored pieces of a life he had packed away. In the dream, he felt no panic, only a strange, hollow sense of inevitability. He didn't know who had moved it. He only knew it was no longer in the dark. When he woke, the morning light was pale and gentle. And there, draped over the back of the wooden chair near the window, was a cardigan. Not his. It was a soft, light gray, the knit fine and comforting. It smelled faintly, unmistakably, of lavender, Eleanor's scent. There was no note this time. No playful excuse. Just the cardigan. It stayed on the chair all morning, a silent, woolen question. Alex tried to ignore it. He made coffee, listening to the familiar sounds of Eleanor moving about downstairs. He ate toast with honey, staring out the window at the orchard. He read half a chapter of a book he didn't remember starting, his eyes scanning the words without absorbing them. But every time he moved through the room, his gaze flicked toward the chair. It was an object imbued with intent. The knit was so fine, and the cuffs were rolled just once, as if waiting for a pair of hands. The familiar scent of lavender clung to it in a way that made it impossible to believe it was just a piece of clothing. It was a message. An offering. He felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. A scarf was one thing, a small accessory easily dismissed as a mistake. A compact mirror was another, a tool, something impersonal. But a cardigan was an article of clothing meant to be worn, to be inhabited. It was a step across a line he had meticulously drawn around himself his entire life. It was an invitation to feel a different kind of warmth, a different kind of comfort. And he didn't know if he was brave enough to accept. Around noon, Eleanor appeared in the doorway of his room, drying her hands on a kitchen towel. Her presence was so casual it felt artfully staged. "You heading into town with me?" "What for?" Alex asked, his voice sounding a little too defensive to his own ears. "Groceries. And I want to check the farmer's market before all the good tomatoes disappear," she said, her eyes bright. Then, she let her gaze flick to the chair, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. "Might get a little chilly later." "That's a nice one," she nodded toward the cardigan. "If you want to borrow it." The offer was delivered with the lightness of a feather, but it landed with the weight of an anvil. "It's fine. I'm not cold." "No, thank you." The easy refusals lined up in his mind, his standard arsenal of deflection. But the words stalled on his tongue. It wasn't cold in the house, but the thought of walking through the bustling market, of feeling the soft, warm knit over his shoulders, felt appealing. It felt like a shield, but a soft one. A comfort. "I'll think about it," he said, and knew as soon as the words were out that this was as close to a yes as he could manage. It was a concession not to her, but to the part of himself that was tired of saying no. The market was a riot of sound and color, all cheerful chatter and the rich, earthy smell of ripe fruit and fresh bread. He trailed behind Eleanor as she navigated the stalls with an expert's ease, bartering good-naturedly for peaches, accepting cheese samples on the end of a toothpick, and inspecting jars of local honey as if they held ancient secrets. He found himself acting as her basket holder, a silent, peripheral figure. And yet, he was hyper-aware of his own presence. Every so often, he caught someone glancing at them, at her, with her bright scarf and easy laugh, and at him, the tall, quiet young man beside her. They were casual glances, the meaningless, fleeting curiosity of strangers. But today, walking beside her with the soft, gray cardigan now settled on his shoulders, each glance felt different. He felt a strange, paradoxical mix of profound safety and acute exposure. He was hidden in plain sight, sheltered by the borrowed warmth of the sweater, yet more visible than he had been in years. On the walk back to the car, Eleanor handed him a fragile paper bag. "Hold these," she said, nodding toward the heirloom tomatoes nestled inside. "They bruise easy." She didn't say like you, but in the quiet space between them, he heard it anyway. Back at the house, she busied herself in the kitchen, the sounds of her unpacking and washing vegetables a comforting domestic rhythm. Alex wandered out of the kitchen and down the hallway, drawn once again by the silent pull of the mirror. He stopped in front of it. The cardigan, her cardigan, softened the sharp angles of his frame, blurring the rigid lines he usually presented to the world. He leaned closer, not to admire the image, but to check it, to find the flaw, to see if it looked wrong. It didn't. "Try this," Eleanor's voice called from the kitchen. He turned to find her standing there, holding out a perfect peach, its skin flushed with red and gold, its fragrance filling the air between them. He took it from her. The fuzzy skin was warm from the sun. He took a bite. An explosion of sweetness flooded his mouth, juice so ripe and abundant it slipped past his lips and down his wrist. It was pure, unadulterated summer. Eleanor watched him, a slow, knowing smile spreading across her face. "See," she said softly. "Some things you just have to taste to know they're right." That evening, after they had finished the simple dinner of pasta with the market's sun-warmed tomatoes, Alex found a new offering waiting for him. It was resting on his dresser, next to the silver compact, small and unassuming. A silk hair tie, the color of a dusky plum. There was no note, no explanation. It was simply there, like the scarf, like the cardigan, another piece of a puzzle he was beginning to understand. This time, he didn't take it back to her. The act of returning it felt like a protest, and he was no longer sure what he would be protesting against. Her methods? Or his own quiet curiosity? The thought of confronting her, "Why do you keep leaving your things in my room?" felt exhausting and pointless. They both knew this wasn't about her being forgetful. Instead, he picked it up. The silk was smooth and cool against his fingertips. He told himself it was just so he wouldn't lose it, a practical measure. He looped it twice over his wrist. It settled there, a soft, dark band against his skin. He flexed his hand, watching the way it moved with him. It didn't feel like a hair tie. It felt like a bracelet. He caught his reflection in the darkened windowpane, a ghostly image against the blackness of the night outside. The cardigan was still draped over the chair. The green scarf was folded on the nightstand. And now this dark plum loop was on his wrist. These objects were accumulating, creating a new vocabulary in the quiet space of the room. He walked down the hall to the mirror, the real one, the one that didn't lie. In its clear, unwavering gaze, the hair tie looked like it belonged there. It was in that moment, staring at the stranger who was also himself, that a profound and unsettling realization dawned on him. Eleanor wasn't asking him to change. She wasn't even pushing him. She was doing something far more powerful, far more subtle. She was making change feel inevitable. She was meticulously constructing a reality around him, a world where softness was the default, where these gentle, feminine-coded objects were simply part of the landscape of his room, of his day. She was laying a path of breadcrumbs so enticing and logical that to not follow it would require more effort than to simply take the next step. Each item, the scarf, the mirror, the cardigan, the hair tie, was a quiet permission slip. She wasn't asking him to become someone else. She was masterfully creating a space where the person he already was, the person hidden in the dusty box of his memory, could finally, safely emerge. The realization didn't feel like being trapped. It felt terrifyingly like being understood. When the stream went live, Alex sat stiffly in the chair, a black cape draped over his shoulders. The fabric felt foreign. The professional ring light felt like an interrogator's lamp. He watched Eleanor's face on the tablet screen, seeing her transform into her calm, confident online persona. Her hands, however, were what held his focus. They moved with a steady, unhurried care that was both mesmerizing and deeply soothing. "We're going to start with a primer," she announced to her audience, but her eyes met his for a brief moment in the compact mirror she held. "It just creates a smooth, safe canvas for everything that comes after." The cool gel felt startling against his skin. His first instinct was to flinch, to recoil from the unfamiliar sensation. But he forced himself to remain still, to breathe. He felt the soft, whisper-light touch of a brush dusting powder across his forehead, his cheeks, his jaw. With each pass, he felt a layer of his own tension being gently brushed away. Eleanor kept up a cheerful, easy patter for her viewers, explaining each step without ever pointing out the obvious, that his shoulders had relaxed, that his clenched jaw had softened, that he'd stopped fidgeting. She was working on him, but she was talking to them. "The goal isn't to hide anything," she said, her voice a warm murmur as she blended a light layer of foundation. "It's just about evening the tone, so the light can fall in a kinder way." He listened to her words, and they felt like a secret code meant only for him. "Kinder light." The phrase echoed in his mind. Then came the blush, so faint it could have been a trick of the lighting. A soft sweep of color just on the apples of his cheeks. She passed him a handheld mirror. His hands trembled slightly as he took it. He was afraid to look. Afraid of seeing a parody, a joke, a man in clumsy makeup. He braced himself for the familiar, gut-wrenching cringe of seeing a stranger in his own skin. He lifted the mirror. The breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a stranger. It was him. But it was a version of him he had only seen in flashes, in his most private thoughts. The harsh angles of his face were softened, the shadows under his eyes gentled. The blush wasn't just a color, it was the suggestion of a warmth that he always felt on the inside, but could never express on the outside. It was a reflection that finally aligned with the person he knew himself to be. It was still him, but the sharpness at the edges, the defensive lines carved by years of holding himself in, had melted into something approachable, something warm. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't want to look away. "There," Eleanor said softly, setting her final brush down. Her voice on the stream was for everyone, but her eyes were on him. "Not a different person," she said, her words landing with quiet, earth-shattering force. "Just more visible." After she signed off and the bright ring light clicked off, the living room fell back into its intimate, shadowed self. The spell was broken, but the feeling remained. Eleanor didn't say anything about how different he looked or how brave he was. The silence was its own form of respect. She simply untied the cape from his shoulders, the rustle of the fabric loud in the quiet room. Then, she picked up the pale green scarf from the back of the sofa and handed it to him. "Keep it," she said. This time, the words weren't a question or a test. They were a statement. A coronation. And for the first time, Alex didn't argue. He took the silk from her hand, its coolness a welcome shock, and let it rest in his own. After dinner a few nights later, they lingered at the table, the remains of a lemon herb chicken cooling between them. The air was comfortable, saturated with the easy silence they had cultivated. Eleanor poured herself a second glass of white wine, then tipped the bottle toward him in a silent offer. He shook his head. She studied him for a moment, her thumb tracing the delicate stem of her glass. Her expression was calm, but her eyes held that steady, resolute light he'd come to recognize as the prelude to something important. "I need to tell you something, Alex," she said, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the stillness. He waited, his body tensing, a familiar coil of apprehension tightening in his gut. "Before you came here," she began, her gaze unwavering, "I visited your parents. I was helping your mother sort through some things in the attic. We were looking for those old photo albums, the ones from your school years." His chest tightened. The attic. His old room. The closet. The box. "We didn't find the albums right away," she continued, her voice impossibly even. "But I did find a box. On the top shelf of your old closet." The air between them went completely still, thick and heavy. He could hear the frantic thud of his own pulse in his ears. He stared at the table, at the pale, circular ring his water glass had left on the dark wood. "I wasn't snooping," she added gently, her voice softening with empathy. "It fell when I was moving a heavy suitcase. The lid came off." He couldn't look at her. The scene played out in his mind in horrifyingly vivid detail, the contents spilling onto the floor, his secret life exposed under the bare bulb of the closet. He finally managed to find his voice, but it was thin, a fragile thread of sound. Did you tell her?" "Yes," Eleanor said simply. The word landed like a stone thrown into a deep, silent well. He braced himself for the splash, for the story of his mother's confusion, her worry, her pain. "She said," Eleanor continued, and a small, sad sweet smile touched her lips, "she said she wished you'd told her sooner. That she's proud of you, even if she doesn't know the whole story yet." She leaned forward, her eyes holding his, willing him to believe her. "She asked me to make sure you knew you were safe. That whatever name you choose, whatever reflection you see, she will love you. Just the same." His throat closed. He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. He didn't cry, not exactly, but his vision blurred until the outline of his aunt's face softened into a warm, indistinct glow, the only solid thing holding him in place. Eleanor reached across the table and set her hand over his. Her touch was warm and firm. "This month wasn't about rest, Alex. Not really. It was about giving you a space where you could finally meet yourself without being afraid." For the first time, he didn't pull his hand away. He turned his palm up and laced his fingers through hers. Later, much later, when he went up to his room, he found it. A small velvet-covered box, the color of a deep midnight sky, sat on his dresser. It hadn't been there before. He stood in the doorway, staring at it, his heart beginning to beat a new, unsteady rhythm of terror and hope. When he finally picked it up, it was lighter than it looked. Inside, nestled in delicate, folded tissue paper, was a neatly bound stack of pamphlets, Understanding Hormone Therapy. A guide to safe, monitored transition care. They were from a local gender clinic. Beneath them was a printed appointment card, the lines for the date and time left blank. And at the very bottom, a handwritten letter in his mother's familiar, looping script. "My dear Alex," it began. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to. You don't have to decide today or tomorrow or ever. I just want you to know the choice is real, and it is yours to make. I love you. Love, Mom." He set the letter down carefully, as if the paper itself were fragile. Behind him, Eleanor leaned against the doorframe. She didn't ask if he'd open the box. She could see the answer etched onto his face. "You don't have to rush," she said, her voice a soft murmur in the quiet room. "This isn't a road you sprint down. But we wanted you to know the door is unlocked. That your mother and I both have our hands on it, holding it open for you." He didn't answer. He sat on the edge of the bed, the velvet box open before him. The green scarf was still on his nightstand. He looked from the pamphlets to the scarf, from his mother's words to his own reflection in the darkened window. They were all just different parts of the same story. He was finally beginning to see how they might fit together. He picked up the appointment card. The empty space for the date no longer looked like a void. It looked like a beginning. The next morning, the green scarf was back. This time, it wasn't folded on a chair or tucked into a pile of laundry. It was laid across his pillow, a slash of pale green against the stark white of the sheets, a deliberate and unignorable message he was meant to see before he was even fully awake. He sat up and stared at it, a slow smile touching his lips. It was absurd, theatrical, and so completely Eleanor. He carried it downstairs, letting it dangle from his fingers by one end. He found her in the kitchen, slicing a loaf of sourdough bread with steady, practiced strokes. "You have a habit of leaving things in my room," he said. It wasn't an accusation, more of a statement of fact, weary but amused. Eleanor glanced up from her work, her eyes twinkling. "Maybe they're leaving themselves there," she offered, her tone light and philosophical. "Ever think of that?" He smirked, leaning against the counter. "Right. Self-walking accessories. A new age phenomenon." "Stranger things have happened," she said, sliding 2 slices of bread into the toaster. She turned to face him, her expression shifting from playful to something more focused. "Like you coming all the way out here to rest and actually, finally resting?" He felt a flush of warmth, a mix of embarrassment and gratitude. "Is this your way of keeping me entertained?" A slow drip of scarves and cardigans. She didn't answer immediately. She buttered the toast when it popped, her movements slow and deliberate, each stroke a moment of consideration. Then she looked at him, her gaze direct. "Actually," she said, "I do have something in mind. Tonight, I'm hosting a little live stream again. A few of my regulars have been asking to see a before and after demonstration." She set the knife down, finally meeting his eyes fully. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt still and charged. "Would you let me use you as my model?" He blinked. The words seemed to hang in the space between them, shimmering and dangerous. My model?" For makeup, she clarified, though he knew exactly what she meant. "A simple look, something fresh. Nothing dramatic. Just light and shadow, remember." She spoke the phrase like a password, a key to a room he was standing in front of. "I'm not." He stopped himself. "Not what?" The words clamored in his mind. "Not the type. Not interested. Not ready." All of them felt true, and all of them felt like lies. They were the automatic defenses of a lifetime, the walls he had built brick by careful brick. But he had spent the last week feeling the foundations of those walls begin to crumble. She didn't press him. She saw the conflict waging in his eyes and gave him an immediate retreat. "Think about it," she said gently. "There's no pressure. If it's a no, it's a no. I'll use a mannequin head. It won't be the same, but it'll work." All day, the question hung in the air like humidity, thick and inescapable. At lunch, sitting across from her, he almost said yes. While reading on the porch in the afternoon, the gray cardigan draped over his shoulders, he almost said no. Every time he passed the mirror in the hallway, he caught himself glancing at his own face, at the canvas, and wondering. He wondered how much a simple look could really change it. He wondered what it would feel like to surrender, to sit still and let her steady hands show him a version of himself he'd only ever dared to imagine. By evening, the living room was already set up. The ring light cast its perfect, expectant circle of light. The wildflowers stood in their vase. The emperor's throne was empty, waiting. And on the arm of the sofa, the gray cardigan was neatly folded, as if it, too, was waiting for a decision. "You decided?" Eleanor asked, her voice as casual as if she were asking if he wanted tea or coffee. He hesitated, his gaze moving from her kind, patient face to the waiting chair. The safe answer was no. The safe answer was the answer he had given himself his entire life. But the safe answer wouldn't stop the quiet, insistent curiosity. It wouldn't silence the part of him that was hungry to see. "Okay," he said finally, the word quiet but firm. "But keep it simple." Her smile was small, but it was radiant. It reached her eyes and filled them with a light that looked like pride. "Always," she said.